When you edit geometry through scripting, then there are a few classes that are very important, and I will discuss these classes in this video. As you can see right now, I am in the Python editor and I have written down a few lines of code. And I suggest that if you want to copy that code, you pause the video right now and then you can copy it. Alternatively, I will post this code on the Foundry's forum, and I will provide a link to that post in the description of this YouTube video. When editing geometry, then there are a few classes that are very important, and let me go to the wiki, and I am in the TD SDK, and you see I have highlighted mesh. So when I go to my mesh, you have class modo.item.mesh, and I've highlighted some things. I've also MeshGeometry module open and the MeshVertices class open. I will come back to this later on in the video, but first let me show you what this code actually does. So in my viewport over here, I have a plane, as you can see, and in my item list, you see that item with the plane geometry has been selected. And now when I run this code several times, you will see that one vertex is being shifted. I'm clicking each time and you see, I hope it's visible in the video, that one vertex is moving its position. And this is the code responsible for it. And when I scroll down to the output window, I have some print statements. And now I will discuss the code and the things that I want to highlight. So I do an import of modo, and then I create an instance of modo.item.mesh, and I call it varmesh. So when I go to the wiki and the item module, I have an instance of the class mesh, and it takes an optional argument. And the important part is that if no argument is provided, then an attempt will be made to wrap the most recently selected mesh layer. So, going back to modo, that means that the recently selected mesh layer is plain. So, the mesh class will be a reference to that geometry. If no geometry is selected, so I'm going to deselect plane, I will get an error. So I'm going to clear the output window, run the code, and you see no valid mesh item selected. So for this code to run, you have to have a mesh item layer selected. So I have my mesh item, then I do a print, and then I call the geometry attribute for that mesh item, and I place that also in a variable called vargeom. So when I go back to the wiki, so I am in the class mesh. Over here it says the mesh geometry can be accessed by the geometry attribute, and geometry attribute return type is mesh geometry. So going back to modo, when I say vargeom equals varmesh, which is my mesh.geometry, then vargeom return type will be mesh geometry. When I go to the wiki, when I go to the MeshGeometry module, you see now this is the class that will be instantiated with the .geometry attribute of the mesh class. And this class also has an attribute called vertices, and several others, but in my code I'm only using the example vertices, and that has as return type a MeshVertices object. So when I go to MeshVertices, that is an extension class of the point accessor that adds iteration methods, and the individual vertex objects can be accessed through the built-in iterator function or angular brackets, and I will come back to that later. So I will continue to discuss the code. So I do also a print of that variable. Let me run the code and then you can see the prints. So I do print of varmesh is modo.mesh. I do print of vargeom is modo.MeshGeometry, as I shown you earlier. And then I will continue. So I also create a variable called varvertices, and that is varmesh, which is my mesh item, .geometry.vertices. And I could also, since I already have a variable where I have created an instance to the mesh geometry, I have set over here varvertices equals vargeom.vertices. And this is something that I wanted to, that is actually the point of this video. I'm at the end, and I'm going to come to that later. I have several print statements and several for loops, and they actually all do the same, but I'm going to first continue with my code over here. So print var vertices equals modo.mesh.geometry.meshVertices. So this is a MeshVertices, or an instance of the MeshVertices object. Then continuing on this statement, I do a print, but I also do a call to var vertices angle brackets 0. So when I have the output var vertices 0 equals modo.MeshVertex 0. So var vertices angular brackets 0 returns a MeshVertex instance. And let me go back to the wiki. So I'm in the class MeshVertices, and as I said earlier, it's a class of the point accessor that adds iteration methods, and the individual vertex objects can be accessed through the built-in iterator function or angular brackets. In other words, when I have my reference and then do angular brackets and an index, this is a manner in which I can access the individual vertices. I hope all of this isn't too confusing. I have spent some time going over everything, and it's in first instance not that easy to get, but once you know what this code actually does, it's actually beginning to make sense. So I'm going to continue to explain the code and then recap, and I hope I'm not too confusing with explaining everything. So now that I have my MeshVertices instance called var vertices, I can access the individual objects through the angular brackets, and then I do a print of the x, y, and z attributes of MeshVertex. So the MeshVertices object can be accessed through the angular brackets, and that returns a MeshVertex object. So var vertices angular brackets 0 angular bracket, that is actually an instance to a MeshVertex object. And on a MeshVertex object, I can call, for instance, the X attribute and the Y attribute and the Z attribute. So I'm going to go to that portion of the wiki. So MeshVertex, and that is a class representing a single vertex. And I have several methods, and underneath over here I can get the connected vertices, and I get the X, Y, and Z getter and setters. So as a getter, it returns the X position, X, and as a setter, takes a float value to set the X position from. So to recap, when you have a MeshVertices object, then you can access the individual vertex objects through the built-in iterator function or angular brackets. And that returns a MeshVertex object, and that can be accessed through several functions, including X, Y, and Z. So going back to my code. So in the code, I do a print of the vertex with index 0 and its X, Y, and Z attributes. And then I also subtract 0.02 of X, Y, and Z. And so as you can see in the video or in the viewport, every time I execute that code, that vertex with index 0 is being moved in X, Y, and Z by exactly 0.02 units. And then I do again a print to see the difference before and after of those values. And then after you have done editing, then you have to call the setMeshEdits function of the MeshGeometry class. So here I have modo.item.mesh brackets .geometry.setMeshEdits. But I also could say vargeom.setMeshEdits, since vargeom, and when I go over here, is an instance of MeshGeometry. Or I could also say varmesh.geometry.setMeshEdits. Varmesh is my mesh item. .geometry returns the MeshGeometry. So when I have a return of the MeshGeometry, I can set MeshEdits, or I can do modo.item.mesh, so that is my selected mesh in the item list, .geometry, which returns a MeshGeometry. So, and I have deleted something, so modo.item.mesh returns a MeshGeometry item. On such an item, I can call the function .geometry, which gives me my MeshGeometry item, and on a MeshGeometry item, sorry for that, I can call the function setMeshEdits. So setMeshEdits, it's in MeshGeometry module, and when I go over here, setMeshEdits updates MeshEdits, applying previous changes. And that is actually what I wanted to show you. I also have some prints that I do in for loops, so it's exactly the same each time. For variable varVertex in varVertices, print varVertex, and here these for loops are exactly the same but with different notations. So in this for loop I do in vargeom.vertices, in this for loop I do in varmesh.geometry.vertices, and over here I do in modo.item.mesh round brackets .geometry.vertices. And although all of these varVertices, vargeom.vertices, varmesh.geometry.vertices, and so on are different instances, they all point to the same geometry. So when you have made an instance like vertices, and I go back, vertices is varmesh.geometry.vertices, and varmesh is my mesh. Then I can say this short notation for vertex in vertices. When I have not created such a variable, and not a MeshGeometry variable, and not a MeshVertices variable, then I have to write the complete phrase like that to access the geometry. Now this is probably very confusing when you have a first look at this, but actually once you understand what I am trying to say, and I hope I'm doing a good job at it, then actually it makes very good sense. So I'm going to recap everything now that I have discussed the code and have shown you what it does. So you have your modo.item.mesh. I'm going back to the wiki. Your class mesh that can be accessed by its geometry attribute, and that returns a MeshGeometry object. So if I take this one, model.item.mesh.geometry returns a MeshGeometry object. And on a MeshGeometry object, when I go to the MeshGeometry over here, so that provides access to the geometry of a given mesh, and I can call an attribute called vertices. I can call others, but in my example I've called vertices, and that return type is MeshVertices. So when I go back to my code, modo.item.mesh.geometry.vertices returns a MeshVertices object, and then I go back to the wiki, and a MeshVertices object, as said before, that can be accessed through the built-in iterator function or angular brackets. So back to the code, and I haven't done anything else than a print statement over here, but so var vertices over here, that is my mesh vertices object that can be accessed through the angular brackets, and when you access it like that, then your object that is being returned is a MeshVertex object. And MeshVertex objects, they can be accessed through X attribute, Y attribute, and Z attribute. So when I go back over here, MeshVertices, and underneath is the MeshVertex class, as you can see here. So when I showed this earlier, you have also vertices that returns the connected vertices, but also X, Y, and Z, and other stuff. So that's actually what I wanted to show you. You have your mesh, and the geometry can be accessed through the geometry attribute. It returns a MeshGeometry. MeshGeometry, your MeshGeometry class can be accessed through several attributes also. For instance, vertices, and that returns a MeshVertices object. Then MeshVertices can be accessed through angular brackets, and when you access it through angular brackets, it returns a MeshVertex object, and the MeshVertex object can be accessed through, by, amongst others, X, Y, and Z. So that is actually what I wanted to explain in this video. I hope it wasn't too confusing. I can also give another example. So when I press N for a new layer and, for instance, create a cube, a unit cube, and I now run the code several times, and I'm getting Z is not defined. Oh yeah, I have Z selected over here in the Python editor, so it's only executing that line Z. So I deselected everything, clear everything, and run my code. Now you see every time I click the vertex with index 0 is being displaced by these lines, and then also ending with modo.item.mesh.geometry.setMeshEdits. When I create another layer and, for instance, a cylinder, exactly the same thing will happen, but yeah, it's on the back side, you didn't see it, so when I click several times you see. But this is not important what the code actually does. What I wanted to explain in this video is that you create your mesh instance, and the mesh instance has an attribute called geometry, which returns a MeshGeometry object. The MeshGeometry object has an attribute called vertices that returns a MeshVertices object. And MeshVertices object can be iterated or accessed through angular brackets. And when you do so, that returns a MeshVertex object. And then you can call several attributes like X, Y, and Z for the MeshVertex object, and then alter them like I've done in the code, and then you do your set mesh edits, and then you have changed your code. But it was the connection between MeshGeometry, MeshVertices, and MeshVertex class that I wanted to make clear in this video. I hope I've done a good job at it. So as I've said, I'm going to post the code on the forum and provide a link to it, and then you can check out yourself to learn about all of these classes. So I hope you found it useful. Bye for now.